everything works, and at the moment it does. So we'll erase this and we will get started. So the question becomes, or the question I want to start thinking about is this. We are, in some respects, we are living in what we can call a post-modern and now the controversial part, post-God world. And I want to talk about what this means, why it's important to the conversation that we're having. So if we go back to the 19th century, we have two people on one side of the equation, Feuerbach and Nietzsche. On the other hand, we have Soren Kierkegaard. Taking them in kind of reverse order. For Kierkegaard, Christianity has become effectively corrupt. Doctrinal purity, or purity of doctrine, has taken precedence over actual religious faith. For Nietzsche and Feuerbach, ultimately, God is dead. So when we think about the concept of the death of God, we want to keep in mind that it does not necessarily mean that there is no God. The question for Nietzsche specifically is going to be the relevance of faith in God. And as far as he's concerned, that relevance can be summed up in the idea that God has become a logical necessity. Specifically, without God, there is no good, there is no evil. In this sense, the definition of God becomes a kind of foundation based on logic and not on experience. So we relate to logic, we don't relate to a being, a person, an entity. The argument that Feuerbach is going to advance is fairly similar. Insofar as God becomes an idealized standard or conception of what it means to be human. In either case, their point is that the artificial construct takes precedence over experience. We want to keep in mind, as we're writing this, that Nietzsche did write a poem called To the Unknown God. I don't think it's debatable as to whether or not Nietzsche believed in God. I think the answer is, in some shape or form, yes. But there is a difference between the God that is experienced versus the God that is logically necessary. In one of our conversations a few weeks ago, we drew a distinction between Paul Tillich and Karl Barth. And when we talked about Barth, we said that his line of argument is characterized as Neoorthodoxy, which is ultimately a theological reclamation. And by that I mean it is specifically targeting a kind of return to the essence of Christian doctrine. So we're moving back toward a kind of systematic theology that Descartes would have been comfortable with, but Edward Herbert would not have been comfortable with. Tillich's experience, or Tillich's argument, is very similar to the argument advanced by Martin Buber in his book I and Thou. I and Thou essentially talks about a personal relationship between the human and the divine. In such a way that as I stand in relationship to God, and God in relationship to me, there is a kind of transference, a kind of valuing that is transformative insofar as Buber draws a distinction between thou and you in terms of where we are in society. The you is the more objectified. The thou is the more personal encounter, the person to person. Okay. Thoughts? Am I making sense so far? Okay. I'll give you a second to catch up. So if we go back to some of what we've discussed in the last couple of weeks, I'm prepared to argue that Christianity is dead. Define dead as you want, but as far as I'm concerned, it means largely irrelevant. It cannot speak to the problems we face. And if anything, it has made the problems worse. Whether we talk about abortion or the war in Ukraine. That, in fact, if we go back to our conversation about Christianity in the 19th century, Christianity is aligned with the structure of power and not the people. And as far as I'm concerned, I would make the case that even liberation theology has ultimately been a failure. If we think about our discussion about the World Council of Churches, it's been trying for the better part of 90 years now to formulate a response to social injustice. And that response has been a failure. The transformation promised by liberation theology in the third world has not occurred. If anything, it has aided and abetted the rise of people like Maduro and people continue to languish in the same poverty they've languished in for hundreds of years. Third, I'm going to call it the diaspora of Christianity. In the true sense of the word, scattering. And by that I mean Christianity has broken down into a collection of ineffective traditional mainline churches into a collection of non-denominational churches, largely driven by the cult of personality. which is to say it's not so much the message as it is the messenger. So, for example, if you drive around Greensboro, there are billboards, and now we have not just the photograph of the preacher, but we have the preacher and the preacher's wife. And they're usually dressed the same, and they look very chic. Or at least they look like the population they're intending to capture. And they're all well branded, so we have all kinds of interesting names. Integrity Church, the Destination Church. And as one of my conservative friends has noted, the ceremony is less about scripture and more about fire and music and fireworks and all kinds of rock bands. It's the experience. And in the end, the breakdown of Christianity means that the focus ultimately has become a kind of conservative adherence to some form of doctrine that may loosely conform to what we might call traditional Christianity. Another example, a friend of mine was listening to a podcast, and the woman doing the podcast was arguing that the reason the world is screwed up is because the sons of Adam and Eve married the daughters of Satan. Now, how specifically she pulled that out of Scripture, I can't begin to tell you. But in the end, if she can attract people, and if they're willing to make a donation, then whether her, quote, truth, unquote, is founded or not, it has a toehold. And if we think about people like Joel Osteen and the so-called big box churches, it all comes down specifically to the cult of the messenger. His or her, I'm sorry?
We should call Eve Satan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have these huge, architecturally stunning churches, and Osteen answers to no one, other than his ability to attract people and his interpretation of Scripture. The argument I want to make is that whether it's Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, it all comes down to the same thing right now. In Islam, it's the cult of the mullah. Whoever heads the mosque delivers his version of truth, however radical or liberal that might be. And in Judaism, it's the same thing. So in addition to arguing that Christianity is broken, I would argue that all the major religions of the world have failed and are failing. All right, questions, thoughts, comments? Is this making sense? Okay. So, in a way that strikes me as extremely ironic, one way of reading Herbert is to say that he was arguing that systematic theology was dead. if you recall, his argument is that systematic theology became a kind of filter that was superimposed on experience. As a consequence of that, it skewed our understanding of experience. I don't think he would say what I'm about to say, but I think the implication in modern terms is pretty clear. It had failed to be relevant. Relevant or not, 400 years later, it's still the filter through which we see the world. Whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, name a religion, it's still the filter through which we see the world. And in a life negative culture, we see what the consequences are. The problem with systematic theology is it continues the myth that there is some kind of absolute truth. When in fact the only relevant truth is that to be human is to die. Questions, thoughts? Is this making sense? Okay, so what do you think about this before I go on?
That makes sense. Especially that part we were talking about how you for example, adult listening like the churches in the chat, versus what they actually really say. And that kind of goes to the conversation I was talking about with my parents, because they were like, when you're in college, you know, it's this kind of church, and I thought it was like, I don't really know which one to go to because there's so many. And they were like, you just have to kind of get them to see what the message is. And I was like, well, what will attract me to the church in the first place? And then they just kind of got in an argument with me and like, even in my churches to be big and bold and, you know, have a big old celebration for music and everything, or should it be more mellow and conservative and not, you know, helpful together with the things. So I'm thinking about all of the history and everything now, it makes a lot of sense to our churches.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how they extravagant, you know, set up or music and all that to attract people to their church.
Yes. When I moved to the South, it was interesting to be asked. Among the first questions I was asked was, what church do you go to? And that was usually preceded by or immediately followed by, are you married? That was largely foreign to my experience in the North. In the North, there was kind of a dualism between Catholic and Protestant. And having grown up Catholic, we didn't see the shades of gray in terms of what constitutes Protestantism. They were all sort of lumped together in one sum. And conversely, one of the reasons world religions is taught here is that one of the consistent comments I get or questions I get when people find out I was raised Catholic is that Christian? Well, it is. But with the breakdown, particularly of Protestantism, every individual church becomes a kind of ideological community. You join that church because politically, socially, everybody shares your values. So if you think of it in terms of an ideological community, then belief is second to values. Everybody looks like me, everybody thinks like me, everybody votes like me, everybody enjoys what I enjoy. To that extent, it's one of the answers to the breakdown of contemporary society. We retreat back to our tribe. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The history of religion in the modern world cannot be separated from murder, oppression, imperialism, racism. It's particularly interesting as a former Catholic to think about what's been happening in the Catholic Church. Because of the Church's continued endorsement of celibacy, problems with alcoholism and pedophilia and other forms of corruption in its hierarchy are rampant. But we cling to doctrinal purity, or the perception of doctrinal purity, over the reality of the world in which we live. If we think about the glory of the Catholic Church, if you haven't been to Central and South America, you can walk into a town, as I did numerous times, that suffered rampant poverty. But the church was always first rate. If we think about George Holyoake, his mother was paying the church tax while his sister was dying. And in every war, there is a priest or a minister who blesses troops on both sides of the coin. And the end is the same: murder, oppression, imperialism, and racism. Theoretically, religion is supposed to be part of the solution. Clearly it is not. Will Durant once wrote that more people have been killed in the name of a god than any other reason. And if we think about the conflict between Shia and Sunni, couched in terms of disagreements over theology and who would succeed Muhammad, we've been looking at the better part of 1400 years of murder. If Christianity were serious about its message, there would be no poverty left in the world. So over the last few weeks, it seems that I keep coming back in multiple aspects of the work I'm doing to this one principle: the human need for certainty and truth. I'm blinded by the light of God and truth and right, and I wander in the night without direction. And so I'll continue to pretend my life will never end, and flowers will never bend with the rainfall. So when we think about the issues we face, when we think about the dysfunctioning not just of the West, but of the human world, the inability to live in a world that has no certainty save death, and no truth save the reality of death, may in fact be the most critical problem we face. If God did not exist, if we acknowledged that God was truly dead, what in fact would we do? Would we invent a new God? In many respects, haven't we done that? With science? Why do we feel that the Big Bang Theory is so much more accurate than the story in Genesis, when the fact of the matter is neither one of them is true? The reality is we don't know why we're here, if there is a why at all. And we don't know and won't ever know how this came to be. But again, that need for certainty and that need for truth. So even if we take this from a very different perspective, Kierkegaard, dancing around this very question, talks about the leap of faith. That even though there is no proof, you believe anyway. Or if we think about the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, the conclusion is to love God anyway. Despite all of the uncertainty, despite the injustice, despite the theodicy, despite the fact that the wise person and the fool suffer the same fate, love God anyway. Is that enough? And I guess the conclusion that I'm coming to no. No. That, in fact, though he would probably disagree with how I'm about to say it, the best way forward I'll just do this. The best way forward is to begin with the death of God. If there is in any shape or form a future for the human species, it must be a future without God. So if we go back to Auguste Comte, you'll recall he said that there are 3 stages in the development of religion: fetishism, the metaphysical, and positivism. And positivism is essentially the religion of humans. I'm concerned by the fact that the humanism of Comte and the humanism of Holyoake failed, while there are still positivist churches in existence. They are few and they are far between. And the message, which tended to be more systematic than empirical, failed. Brazil, for example, its flag and its national culture are based on the positivism of Comte. Yet the level of social injustice in Brazil dwarfs the social injustice in the United States. So my concern at the moment is that it would appear that every attempt to find a way past the murder, the oppression, and the racism, with or without God, has ultimately failed. The Humanist Manifesto, in all of its forms, is laden with platitudes and lofty ideas. But the world is only marginally more humane than it was 100 years ago. We may not be talking about shutting off city water and sewage and healthcare to poor people in urban America, but we certainly have become a two-class society. And any hope of upward social mobility and economic mobility is all but gone. The fact that most Americans can't afford health care is indicative of the implicit social Darwinistic claim that the poor don't deserve health care. The hold that Thomas Malthus continues to have on contemporary society is breathtaking. So it's not simply a question of killing God and getting over it. The fundamental fear, the belief in the scarcity of food, that was espoused by Thomas Malthus, I would argue, was ultimately not new. It was simply the voice applied to an already existing concern. And to the fear that poor people outbred the rich. So Malthus becomes self-serving. A rich guy talking about the rich fear of a world in which the rich don't have enough food, in which the lifestyle that they feel they are entitled to no longer exists. The implicit argument in Malthus's analysis comes down to some people are intrinsically more valuable. And that idea is not new with Malthus. It's just explicit. If we go back to conversations we've had about Aristotle, you could argue that social Darwinism was a part of his view of the world. If a child is born defective, take it outside the city and let it die. We will limit women who are poor to 2 children. If they have a third, it will be aborted. If they try it again, they will be sterilized, which is tantamount to death. You're either Greek or you're a barbarian. Inherent in all life negative cultures. I'm not sure I have a conclusive enough answer at this point, other than to begin by arguing that God must be dead. And we must take responsibility for ourselves and for the world. Though I'm going to interpret it a bit differently than Camus would have intended it, we need to learn to live and die. like humans and refuse to be a god. And that means learning to live with uncertainty and insecurity. And it means accepting that there is one truth. In a strange way, this takes us back to the end of our conversation last week, and I hope to post that video later today. Moltmann would have us take some solace in the fact that God died with us and for us. And I will again say that there is no solace in the death of God, nor is there any meaning, except to say that if God died, then God is dead, and we are alone. As much as Kierkegaard was accurate in much of what he said, concern about the eternal is pointless in the world in which we live. Concern about God is pointless in the world in which we live. We are living in a world in which our entire species could end instantaneously. We're living in a world in which the potential for silicon life forms to decide to end our existence is a relevant possibility. And yet we continue mindlessly along the way we have for tens of thousands of years. Questions, thoughts, comments? Deanna, you seem to be deep in thought.
It makes sense. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but it does make sense.
Okay, well, feel free not to agree with me. I am here to learn as much from you as you are from me. So where would you disagree?
I think it will have to go back to your question is that you said no. I mean, I can understand that answer, but then your answer, the conclusion to that being that the best way to move forward is to begin because of God and that the future, there is a hope for human, the future without God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, well, as a Christian, obviously not the really head-cutting, but I think it's just the fact that, like, I don't, but I can understand how a lot of people kind of take everything that's happening, like, oh, God hasn't provided, or He hasn't taken care of all of these issues, so like, why would I take the time to believe that He would actually, like, do something to anything, like, He hasn't made anything better all of this time. But I wouldn't necessarily agree that only or any hope for humans would be affected outside. I just think that humans need to, I guess, one, I feel like be more aware of everything that's going on as well, and also just take, like, instead of, like, what you said about the message, like, what was it? Is that, oh, if Christians actually, like, went forth and do what they're supposed to. They wouldn't be, poor people, that hungry people in the world. And I do agree with that because I feel like a lot of Christians kind of get caught that don't do what they're supposed to do. So I feel like if people would take more responsibility, even just in what God says that they should be doing, and not kind of interpret it in a really wild way, that it could be a lot better. But also, I feel like because people do have a lot of different values and they don't all believe the same thing, that because of the lack of unity in the world, that's also
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely on both sides of the spectrum. I do believe that having God and Christianity, having like a God, regardless of whatever religion is, I've been to responsibility, and it's like I wanted to compare it to, like you said, you don't necessarily have to get rid of God to take responsibility. It's like learning how to walk, even though you can sit in a wheelchair your entire life. You choose one or the other, and people make choices. I was speaking to my mom about all this. We finally got to like sit down and have a conversation about religion and philosophy over spring break because I actually had time to spend with her. And she likes to think of, because I was raised as a Christian. I'm floating right now. Not necessarily because I don't believe anymore, but she likes to think of Christianity not as religion, but as a way of life. You live like Christ would have, and you don't necessarily. You're obviously forgiven for your sins, like He's forgiven, God's forgiving, but you still take responsibility for everything that you do, and you live as He would have by serving others.
Mm-hmm. One of the points that we've made in world religion, which is relevant here, is the founder of a religion, with rare exception, and there are exceptions. I would argue that Joseph Smith would be one. The founder of the Mormon Church is usually on an experience of the divine. And that experience of the divine is either perceived to be new, or as you've seen in so many of the religions we've talked about in world religions, a reformation of a previous religion, or rendering it relevant in new historical circumstances. As we move away from the founder, there is a transformation away from the experience to a body of doctrine, to the concept of orthodoxy. This is what it means to be fill in the blank. Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jew. The very move to doctrine and to establishing a normative experience called orthodoxy is that it ultimately kills the experience of the divine. And there's no way back. People have tried. Thomas Merton, Dionysius the Areopagite. They usually end up dead, or they end up totally marginalized.
And it's because they didn't appear to their audience.
Right.
Which nowadays, we were talking about how the parents were talking about finding a church, and we were talking about like when I might look for something. I did this thing. I don't know if you ever heard of this called galvanized. Well, in middle school, your audience was still middle schoolers. But we would go and it would be like, you do it like every week, but it was never a message. It was literally just appeal to the kids, telling them to believe in God. And it was like, they played like normal music, like Shut Up and Dance was on for like, I don't know, every single worship session. And there's like different ways to do it, but they're always appealing to whatever they believe is their audience.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my mom and I had this conversation too, is like Trump. It's like the messenger, but he's appealing to his audience of conservative Republicans.
Absolutely.
Who knows if he actually believes or not.
Yeah. Yesterday, my business coach regularly gets a bunch of business owners together. and a guy showed up with his grandson, who's 19. And at one point, the business coach said, well, since you're all over the age of 40, you're irrelevant. He's 75. And good luck at hiring people because they're not going to want to listen to you. At which point, I about lost it. As you can imagine, given what you know about my life, I've not had a cakewalk. So the grandson is 19. He looks like he's stepped out of a white middle class, working class poster for Christian boys. And his comment back to me was, oh, that's not my world. It's not your world because your father was raised by your grandfather and you've been isolated in this rectangular cube of ultra-conservative Republican Christianity. But that's not the world. And at some point, you're going to be forced to confront the reality of that world and how that applies to the way people are living and dying. Think about the story of the hero in every world religion we've looked at. At some point, they walk away from their isolated, insulated lives because they're forced to confront the reality of suffering and death. That becomes the trigger.
Well, simply because they were forced to.
Yeah.
It was written in their script. But that's where people get stuck in the paradigm.
Yeah.
Because they choose not to.
That's right.
Because they have choice.
Right.
Which is why they're considered religious.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who was raised a conservative Roman Catholic, that part of me died one razor cut at a time as I was forced to confront the reality of the world. Which becomes the point. When the focus is normative experience defined by orthodoxy, a religion ceases to be relevant. And whether you argue that God is dead or Christianity is simply not relevant, the end is still the same. You can't possibly believe in virgin birth and live in the 21st century. You can't believe in the incarnation in the 21st century. You cannot believe in angels in the 21st century. And because of the chasm, the separation, the gulf between what we think we continue to believe and the reality of the world, we cannot solve its problems. Call Christianity a way of life. When you get to that point, it's really not that different from existentialism. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of those who are in pain. But we don't do it. As I said in one of my more blistering articles 6 or 7 months ago, somewhere in the world today, a priest will molest a boy. A minister will stand by while the rich oppress the poor. And it's a problem larger than Christianity. If we truly cared about the future of our species, we would not be behaving this way. Think about it. In the name of freedom, tens of thousands of Ukrainians are about to be killed, if they haven't already. Nationalism is not separable from belief in God. Any adherence to ideology, to an absolute truth, results in the death of people. So, in the name of the right of Ukrainians to determine their future, tens of thousands of people are going to be killed. Where's the logic? And in this county tonight, 1 out of 5 children will go to bed hungry. Where's the logic? So whether we call it God or some form of absolute truth, it's got to go. Because if it does not, our species does not have a future. One irrational moment, and this world is a cinder. All life will end. No one is thinking about that. We're thinking about who's right and who's wrong. After nuclear Armageddon, there is no right or wrong, because we'll all be dead. As Arthur Koestler said, absolute truth murders absolutely. And it doesn't matter whether that truth is God or freedom. The result is the same. I apologize for being more passionate than usual. It's been a particularly rough week. I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, but